Thank you very much, Juan, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for attending the webinar. As Juan mentioned, we will talk about managing feed hygiene for successful transition cows. So I'll share a little bit about some of the work that I'm doing and information that has been done by other colleagues over the years. So the first question is, how to assess feed hygiene, right? And I think in the last, I would say, perhaps 10 years or 15 years, that, there have come to a conclusion, or not a conclusion, but like come up with what hygiene means at the farm level, right? So first, there are a few components associated with this. One is the nutrient analysis, component for the feed, and starch digestibility, in particular the 7-hour digestibility, the mold and yeast count. I'll go through in a few details and providing a little bit more information. Mycotoxins, the most prevalent, worldwide, I would say mycotoxins are everywhere. And about 25% of the sample will have some sort of contamination, either with one mycotoxin or up to 4 or 5 different, mycotoxin. The most common that we deal is DON, by far is the most common, and zearalenone, fumonisin, T2, and aflatoxin. Clostridium count, that is another important, and the enterobacteria, right? And count. But this what we consider, what is a hygiene kit, and that you could collect the sample and do all these testing in most of laboratories. And I think this is, for the most part, in the US or Europe or South America, including in Asia, you could run any of these tests. So I'm going to share a little bit about this study. I really like this study because I think it put in perspective the connection or the interaction between what the cow eat at the farm level, and what show up in milk, right? So, and this is an association. So there was a number of farms, and they were collecting samples on this farm and see whether or not the farm were partially discarding the spoilage, right? Some of those from the corn silage or from the haylage, alfalfa haylage or grass haylage. Partially discard, do not discard any, so meaning they were feeding those to the cow, and some of those farms that they completely discard, so they're very well done, and they remove all the spoilage and feed. And it is interesting to see the difference in that, these are the correlations, right? So they measure in fecal samples, and they also found some, the more you find bacteria in feces, you also find it in milk. So there is a correlation. So hygiene is important, right? Fecal it was correlated both, with TMR, and also what the cow were eating were correlated with, with milk, right? So it is important here, feed, it does have an effect on cows, and it will show up on milk. So this is why it's important. So why we are, discussing this topic today. And another important component is that if you do have a management in place, you almost eliminate the risk. So I think that is also an interesting finding from this study. If you do have a management system in place, you could eliminate some of these challenges, right? So I'll share a little bit. I like this study as well. This is a study on mycotoxin, and in general, mycotoxin and some other inflammatory processes that, in particular in swine, mycotoxins are very sensitive, same in poultry, and it reduced growth by 30%. And 85 of that 30% is due to feed conversion, right? So here is the mycotoxin. So most of these, when the animals are exposed to these, pro-inflammatory toxic compounds. So they do, reduce this feed efficiency or conversion, right? So here is something important also for E. coli. There are different things, digestive bacterial infection, poor housing, E. coli, parasite, respiratory disease. So they all have a different impact, whether that is through feed efficiency, right, or maintenance. They increase the maintenance. So what is also true when you read the literature, that similar things happen to, ruminant. Ruminant has the advantage, swine or poultry are monogastrics, but ruminant has a little bit the advantage on the rumen that it can, to some extent, not all, but to some extent, inactivate some of these toxic compounds. But when it reaches certain level, it do have a negative effect, right? They do have a negative effect, especially in average daily gain, milk component, which is, it really, when it comes to assessing the impact of mycotoxin, you have to understand how a farmer get paid, whether they get paid based on milk, like fluid milk, or they get paid on component, right? So because in our system in the US, most farmers will get paid based on component, fat, and there is a bonus for milk quality. So, and these mycotoxins will do have an impact on both. And also the reproductive negative implication associated with increased abortion. So when looking at the cow rumen function, right? So most of the intake, most of this talk is going to focus about how do we control this contaminated TMR, and in particular the soil or dirt, right, is the ash content. So fiber, forage, they will have, part of the plant, a normal ash content, right? So we'll go through now in a minute. And corn silage is about 5%, and depending on the hybrid and the type of corn. And alfalfa is a little higher. Alfalfa could be about 8 or 9%, the normal, right? Bacterial, which is, the living organism, especially yeast and mold. There is a difference between yeast and mold, and I'm going to specify now how they work together, right? And then the toxic compound, the mycotoxin. Once they go through the system, the digestive tract and the cow. So the first point of contact is the rumen, right? The rumen is, so things that are important to keep in mind is that the cow, feed the rumen. The rumen has the bacteria, it's a symbiosis, and the bacteria feed the cow. So it produces all the nutrients for the cow. So how the rumen works is extremely important. We define that as a rumen function or rumen health. So some of these compounds, whether that is soil, excessive ash content, bacterial load, or mycotoxin, they will, reduce fermentation, especially the fiber, and that is why dry matter intake goes down. Fiber digestion, and that is important to produce a component, especially fat, right? The vitamin B complex and high producing farm, it could be an issue, right? The vitamin B complex produced in the rumen, and there is one of those vitamin B complex that is important for the cow, especially to prevent mastitis, right? Because they produce the keratin plug, right? And if there is enough contamination in the feed, it affects this vitamin B complex, so the cow cannot produce the keratin plug. So this is why you have some of this spike in somatic cell count. And then there is an issue with, antagonism or problem absorbing specific, minerals and vitamins. So excessive ash content will do is like a binder, right? It will remove a specific vitamin, specific minerals, but also a trace mineral, right? So at the end of the day, all the, feed will go through the digestive tract, and it will have this, reduce this digestion process, reduce the immunity. So most of the immune system is in the GI tract. So it's something that we keep, and I'll share now a little bit on those details. We do not want to activate the immune system prior to calving, right? So if we activate the system, that increases, it's a tremendous uptake of glucose for the cow, and some of these animal goes in negative energy balance because we just activate the immune system through some of these toxins. And then it creates, what we know, the inflammatory process. And this is general. So it goes through the digestive tract, but it impacts most of the central organs, especially liver, right? The lungs, and pneumonia is important. They come and go in some of the forms. So, and it kind of follows through some of these hygiene, contamination in our TMR. So we will walk through some of these key points. I want to mention something else about gestation length. This is something that I've been working the last few years on this. And I know, and we know, gestation length is largely determined by the sire, right? The sire will have a major impact on gestation length. The dam will have more impact on birth weight. Both gestation length and birth weight are directly correlated, strongly correlated. The longer they stay inside the cow, the bigger they will come out, right? But there are other factors that could influence some of these stressors, right? Like summer, right? We monitor and we quickly realize the summer is pro-inflammatory, right? Especially when there is no heat abatement. So it will trigger some inflammatory process. And as a stress, process, it increases blood cortisol, and that is what triggers labor, right? So twin pregnancies, excessive body weight or body condition loss prior to calving, extended, DCAT, feeding for extended period, and very low urine pH because of the metabolic acidosis, and feed hygiene, right? What we talked today. So those could, in one or other way, affect gestation length. And this is important for farmers, in particular gestation length, because you're going to have two things. We know that cows that have short gestation length, most of those cows are going to end up being the bulk of the problem in the fresh pen. But also for the calf, if the calf is born in this short gestation cow, regardless of how we manage our maternity and colostrum, we are going to end up having more diarrhea problems early on in life. So morbidity and mortality. So biology is connected, right? And some of these factors, especially when it comes to the feed and the feed quality, it do have an impact. So what is the goal for gestation length? I spent a little bit of time. There is a number of other colleagues that have done studies on this. And for this particular presentation, I divide the gestation length in three groups. And this is what has done others similar. Short gestation, so meaning in a Holstein cow, gestation lengths go from 254 to 298. Right? But there is a number of cows, this is based on 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviation, or 3 standard deviation, right? So there is a number of cows that is what we call the short gestation, 254 to 69. And we know that the goal is we don't want to have more than 12% of those lactation or those pregnancy, being short, less than 12% should be short gestation. And when it comes to the parity, there is a parity effect. So heifers usually has more short gestation than multiparous cows. The bulk of gestation is going to be in the average, right? 270 to 283. And then there is a number of extended gestation. This is important when we use beef on dairy. So those beef bulls do have an implication on gestation. So it could move gestation length one way or the other, right? I'll show you a graph at the very end, about gestation lengths and the implication for the calf. So what defines forage quality, right? So we know now the hygiene, the feed hygiene kit, or how do we measure that, or what are those key components, right? And forage quality is we have to produce enough or sufficient quantity of forage, right? That they do have high digestibility for both fiber and starch, right? And it has to, on top of that, minimal contamination with soil, mycotoxin, and bacteria. And I'm going to try to connect all these because it's associated with the hygiene kit, right? So when we work with forages, so basically what we do is we chop them. It has a big component in agronomy. So because most of the mycotoxin will come from the field, right? And most of the soil contamination is either around the time of harvesting, right? And moving that, when we put together the silo, right? So we need to minimize the contamination with soil, mycotoxins, and reduce the bacterial load. And that will have a profound implication for the farm in terms of productivity and feed cost and revenues. So at the farm level, perhaps the most important, this is just one of the choppers in the farms that we work with, and is when we're the number one is the dry matter. The dry matter when we start chopping that, right? The length of the chop, right? How we process the kernel, the grain, right? And you can see right here in this is what is coming out of the chopper, right? And the ground speed, right? And this is the difference between owning the equipment versus you hire somebody else, right? So the speed matter, right? And the capacity, how much they can process on an hourly basis or per acre or per hectare, right? So this is important. Why this is important? Because this will have to be compacted right away, and it will create this fermentation process, right? So how quick should I seal it? Right away. You do as quick as you can the packing, right, and the sealing. There is a whole coordination in the process. I'm not going to go through the details, but there is about every year when farmers do the corn silage, there is about 10 days that will define the production for the entire year, right? Organizing those 10 days, the logistic at a scale to put together the silo, it is absolutely important. Why is that? Because we do these silos, so we do the chopping, we bring to the silo, compaction, remove the air, right? Create these anaerobic conditions, plus the bacteria that is already on the plant, part of the plant, so the soluble sugars, right? That those lactobacillus will produce lactic acid, and as soon as the lactic acid increase, it reduces the pH. And when the pH drops from about 7 to about 3.5, right, that is kind of an sterilization process. It kills everything, right? So it stabilizes the silo. So we really need, the most important concept here is we need to bring the pH down quick, right? And that pH 3.5 will, kill most of the bacteria, the ones that we don't want. That is why the hygiene kit measures specific things, Clostridium. If pH do not drop below 6, you will have an overgrowth of Clostridium inside your, it could be corn silage or alfalfa, haylage, any of those that are going to go through this fermentation process. Why is sealing, important for this, right? So this is just some measure. I'm not going to go through the detail, but I really want you to think about, do some number here and the losses, right? When we don't do it right, right? So let's say in this bunker silo, right? This is the spoilage, some things that it is really bad for the cow, especially for the rumen of the cow, right? It has a profound negative effect, right, in the cow. But not only is just the top portion the problem, what we can visually see it, but it's that portion, that 2 or 3 feet or a meter down that is exposed to air, right? And that triggers a process of heating, right? So, and this is just to give you an idea whether we do the bunker or we do this, round bale, wraps, or the square, right? If we don't seal it, we have massive losses, anywhere between 25%, or depending on this, if we don't seal it very well, these, they are very handy, the round or the square, but if we don't seal it and have holes in it, right, we lose quite a bit of the nutritional values of those forages. So what happens if we don't do well our silo, right? And this is also true because sometimes farmers may run out of silo and they buy silo or they buy corn silage from another farm. And some is not right next to the farm. It may have to be driving, like, a few hours driving, and then bring the silo to, to the where the cows are, right? And moving open, getting exposed to the air, that create this process, what we call the sequential aerobic deterioration of the, the silo. Once we open it, right, the first things that happen is a massive, this is time, and these are the growth of yeast and molds, right, combined with pH. And on this axis is temperature, right? Once you open the silo, or if the silo is not well sealed, right, the first things happen is you have a massive growth of yeast, right? And yeast, they really like to eat the, lactic acid, right? Especially if there is a lot of lactic acid, you will have a growth, exponential growth of yeast. And that creates the first wave of what we call temperature, right? There is kind of two waves of temperature, right? And right after that, the pH, they used to be stable below like 3.5, well done corn silage, and start, going up, rising up. And it's because of the yeast, getting this lactic acid, right? Once we have the pH up, now is the perfect environment, right? We have a lot of yeast, and it's the, the pH, go up to 6, and now you're going to have an overgrowth of molds. So molds come after the yeast. So this is why I think it's important when you do the hygiene kit to measure both, because sometimes you will have yeast, but you will not have mold yet, and sometimes you will have both, right? So remember about these processes. So there is some delay between the two, right? And temperature might come down when, as soon as the lactic acid run out, there is no more substrate for the bacteria to grow, but then we'll re-pick, go back up again, right? So most dairy farms, and there is a reason, most dairy farms will feed twice a day, lactating cows twice. There are some that could feed 3 or 4 times. I've been in a few other farms, and especially in hot, climate, or more, extended daylight, they feed a more frequent, right? Like 4 or 5 times, right? And dry cows between 2 and 1, especially in the US, this is what we see for most of the farm. When you have extended daylight, it creates a dilemma, right? And the dilemma is that this is just what people see on the farm. So we don't want to feed the cows, right, add too much water in our mixer, because in those extended daylight and hot, environment, what the dilemma they create is they start feeding the TMR drier. Instead of 47, 48 dry matter, they go to 52, right? I mean, because their TMR don't get, hot, right? But the cows, what they do, cows are smart, they increase sorting. So we try to fix one because, to prevent this overheating in the TMR, right? But on the other hand, cows, are if there is not enough water to keep together the small particle, cows will sort against the longer particle size. And that has an implication, right? It has an implication. It looks like we have some ruminal acidosis. Yeah, cows are eating, completely different diet because of the salt, right? So we'll go through in a minute about, how to address some of this. The 4 pillars of feed hygiene assessment, right? These are what we do on the farm. The first is, the soil and mineral contamination, right? The most important, when you do the corn silage, the individual ingredients, or you do the TMR. For most of the forage analysis, the individual ingredient. When it comes to the hygiene kit, right, you could do individual ingredient, but mycotoxin or mold count, you go to the suspected ingredient, or you do the TMR, right? And mycotoxin is the TMR. The TMR is perhaps the number one, sample. When it comes to the nutritional value of things, it's the individual ingredient. So we will have the ash content. You can also get the fermentation profile, especially, butyric acid, if it is too high, it could be a problem. And I'm not going to go through these now, but heavy metal is very rare to find in the US, very, very rare. I haven't seen it. And in Europe and in the US, it's extremely regulated, fertilizers. And but I do see in other countries, right? And especially with cadmium, right? Really high cadmium, and 100 times higher than normal. And it's because of the agronomic component. So these are more sandy soil, they do a lot of irrigation, and they fertilize very heavily. And some of these fertilizers are coming contaminated with cadmium. So the phosphoric rock is contaminated with cadmium. So you have to be very careful because this will have a tremendous negative impact on cows, right? Microbial stability, the mold, the yeast, the pathogenic bacteria, mycotoxins. So, and I kind of come up with an index, to put together all these, so contribution weight in each one of them to come up, just to get a comprehensive view on how, because not all of them, we do have information, and we don't even know if when we have molds, mycotoxin, and especially 4 different mycotoxin, we don't know if the effect is additive, it multiplies. So we kind of come up with an index to kind of rank depending on how the hygiene kits come out. And then looking at the cow level, right? Milk fat, dry matter intake, gestation length, cold, just to get an idea about the content, how cows are responding to management, right? For practical rule, when it comes to the interpretation, yeast and mold, you're going to be reading as fed. They will be reporting in colony forming unit per grams, right? And everything else that you're going to get in a report, you're going to get on a dry matter basis. And this is important for mycotoxin, right? Because you have to ask the lab how they report. If they report on a as fed basis, you had to do the calculation knowing your TMR, how much dry matter is in the TMR, and do the calculation, because that will change the risk. It could be from low risk to high risk, depending on when you do the conversion to a dry matter basis. So this is just in general for information. I'm not going to go through this, but this is already, a number of these already published, and most of the lab will give you some ideas and ranking on a specific, component for fiber, starch quality, hygiene, especially ash content, mold and yeast, Clostridium, and the fermentation product, right? Either pH or butyric acid, right? Butyric acid is something that I really pay attention, especially for transition cow. You do not want to feed, either alfalfa, haylage that has a really high component of butyric acid, because this is butyric acid processed in the liver and trigger ketosis. So it really is a very negative implication for fresh cows, right? But I'm just leaving you these numbers here because those are some of the benchmarks, right? When it comes to the management at the farm level, managing the phase of the silo is perhaps one of the most important, right? And that is an art, because an art is also a science. So you have to kind of know your feeding rate, right? Feed out rate. You know how many cows, how many tons of corn silage you need on a daily basis, and you will synchronize that one. So it is important when doing the training with employees to work through some of these calculations so they get about right the number. Most people will get it. I'll show you a few examples where I think is an opportunity for improvement. But this is a really nice example that people get a really nice on concrete pad, very well sealed corn silage, and they manage the phase, unbelievable. And you won't have any issues with hygiene, especially these overheated, overgrowth of mold and yeast, right? Same is for, this is haylage, right? And a specific device to remove the front of this haylage. Sometimes it's, I really like this device because it allows you to keep the face very clean, right? And it does not, get exposed to oxygen. So this is a really nice tool to keep, some of these haylage, the face of the haylage. When you have visible molds, here is an example of some of these farms we collect. What I call visible mold is sometimes you see something like this in the face of the silo, right? You are very likely dealing with, you know you're going to have mycotoxin, right? And we have done some of the study, and the risk for HBS is the hemorrhagic bowel syndrome, right? Excessive amount of molds and mycotoxin, right? They has a profound effect on cows, right? Most of these mycotoxin come from the field. So when you chop the corn, depending on the weather, it's an open sky business, right? If it is drought, the plant gets stressed, you're going to get a little bit more fungi there. So there is, they come to the corn silage, they are part now of the silo, you start compacting, right? But the fermentation process don't go very well because of the mycotoxin. They are also toxic for some of the bacteria that are responsible to produce, lactic acid, right? So pH do not go below 6. When that happens in some of these silos, you have an overgrowth of these undesirable bacteria. We don't want them. I mean, they are part of the plant and they are part of the ecosystem, but we don't want them, right? So Clostridium is perhaps one of the things that is very, very aggressive for cows, right? And especially the cows that are in the peak of lactation, those cows that are in high producing, like the cows that are at 100 days in milk, right? Because those are the ones that has the highest intake on a per body weight, right? So this increases the risk for intestinal hemorrhagic, syndrome. And what you see, whether you do the palpation or, cows, they will have this, aggressive, event that the cows will have the bleeding inside. So they have a negative effect on the cow. But it's important that you think about it when you see something like this, that you may end up with something like this. So managing the inclusion rate, we cannot change the corn silage. This is what we have, but now we will have to come up with a management strategy to reduce the inclusion and reduce the bacterial load on some of those, for some of those cows. So I'll touch a little bit on how to manage silage with high butyric acid, right? And like I mentioned, right, butyric acid is processed by the liver, so to produce, kind of ketone bodies, like ketosis. So do not feed to fresh cow, transition cows, right? This is by default. If possible, you do not feed them, right? If you do have to feed, now you get to limit the inclusion, right? Limit the inclusion. And how we limit the inclusion? We do it about 50 grams a day per cow, right? So the example is if the haylage comes with 1.5 butyric acid percent dry matter, and so that will be about, the limit will be about 14.55 grams per kilo dry matter intake. So we do the calculation, we limit to 3.4 kilos per cow, right? And then you multiply by this by 14.55, and then you get closer to, the 50 grams per cow a day as a limit for butyric acid. So you need to know, so you need to measure when you suspect this, because if you don't, this will really drop the dry matter intake. It will cause a lot of health issues. It will cause some issues on the farm, but you can manage, right, if you know how much butyric acid, part of the fermentation processes in this haylage. There is an association, right, between ash, versus silage pH. The higher the ash content, the higher the ash content. Here is I combine the two. Probably I shouldn't do it, but I combine the two just for simplicity, but I'm giving you the right, correlation between the two. Right? It is very strong, the ash content in alfalfa. It is moderated to strongly correlated, right? The higher the ash content, you're going to have the higher the pH, right? And in corn is either weak to moderate, depending on, but it do have an impact. So if you got a high ash content in your corn silage, it will do have an impact on pH. Why pH is important? Because it's the end product, it's the lactic acid in the fermentation process. If we don't control pH, you're going to have an overgrowth of these bacteria, undesirable population of bacteria, and that will have an implication and a negative effect for the cows, right? So I'm going to do a summary on, there is a number of articles in the literature and regarding the implication, or the effect of soil contamination on animals. So, and I summarize in 4 points here. The number one is it has a direct effect in the rumen function, and it reduces digestibility of the fiber, right? So this is important because it will affect milk, right, or growth if it is a feedlot, but it also will affect, fat, and some of the fat could fluctuate, up and down, and it's hard to keep, the fat content high. When you look at ash content, it's important in your fiber because the lab report will have two forms of report, what we call the NDF-A, right, that include the ash content. And the ANDF-OM, that is without the ash content. So that is important, I want to just mention, because depending on the report, it will come either both or just one of the two. It increased the spore and these undesirable bacteria, especially the Clostridium, right? And that has an effect, direct effect on dry matter intake and inflammatory process. And ingestion, those, some small stone or clay or silica, and that has some erosion for the cow, especially in the digestive tract. And it acts as a binder also. It removes significant portion of vitamin, especially, vitamin A, D, and E, right? Minerals, due to this sequestration oxidation process, right? So that interferes with all this absorption of these trace minerals, right, and vitamins. So there is not something to take it very lightly. So it's something that really need to keep an eye. And I can see in the last 20 years has been a major transformation on how we used to have, alfalfa with 17% or 14% ash content, and now consistently they are about 8%, right? There have been a major improvement on when it comes to the soil contamination. We cannot manage what we don't measure. So we will have to do something, collect a sample to get an idea, right? And this is from dry matter, particle size, collecting a sample, sending it to the lab, try to get some information back on base, in particular the nutrient composition and the hygiene of a particular ingredient or mycotoxins, in the TMR, right? Most of these, I will do another webinar specific on a TMR audit, specific for this. I think this is something that I see a great opportunity. Many people do it, and because of the value, and it allows the team to work together, right? And but think about this: when you do the TMR audit, you're looking at for the hygiene component and to control variation. You want to control the variation that it creates the system to make sure we don't see this, right? So most cows are consistent, especially when it comes to the the manure. So we are promoting dry matter intake. We are trying to fix some of the problem, rumen health, right? And because at the end of the day, milks, especially fat and low somatic cell and repro, those are the things that will pay the bills at the end of the day, right? But in this particular case, we will focus more on the hygiene component. Right? Getting the sample, I think, is the most important. And you need to be aware there is variation in the sample, right? And for particular nutrient, because in the feed analysis, there are two, different way of, depending on what you are trying to answer, right? So if most people will do individual forages, and they won't do any of the grain because it's very consistent when it comes to the nutrient composition. So you will do the forages individually, the silos, right? And when it comes to mycotoxins, right, if you want to do, you need to, sample what the cows are eating, right? Start the process backward. Now, get an idea what the cows are eating, because this is the most important. You can have one of these ingredients contaminated, but is diluted out in the total TMR. So for mycotoxin, we start with TMR, and then we'll try to figure out which one of the ingredients is contaminated. When it comes to the nutrient composition, you go for a specific nutrient, and most of the time it's the forage, right? But think about it that you need a protocol. You need some sort of protocol to collect it, because most of the variation, so sometimes you get information, you're going to pay for all these, but most of the sampling error comes because we are not very good at collecting the sample, right? Sometimes we pull them together. Yes, there is some error there, but there is very, very little error compared to the whole process at the lab level, especially those labs that have quality control, right? When you submit a sample, just a few key points, right? How much sample you need to submit it, whether they had to be refrigerated or frozen, right? If you are going to do mold and yeast count, you do not have to freeze them. You can refrigerate them and send it to the lab right away. So you have to organize the logistics when it comes to do this hygiene kit, because some of the sample require refrigeration. And remember, most of the time we do have issues with hygiene during the summer, right? And then the laboratory, when it comes to the mycotoxins, and I always recommend the gold standard, the liquid chromatography, and what I highlighted in red here. We don't use much of the, I see that in the field, but I take it more as a yes or no. When I have to quantify, this is the gold standard, right? This is the right assay to collect. And I would say most of the lab, they already got this quality control, and they can run you different panels, 1 mycotoxin or 7 mycotoxin or more, depending on what you wanna test, right? When the result come back, right, specific on mycotoxins, so many of the lab will do have their cut point, or they will have some sort of idea on where those numbers are organized. But think about it when it comes to mycotoxin, that is, when it comes to the regulatory aspect, aflatoxin is zero tolerance because it's regulated, globally. So we don't want that. It has zero. So you cannot have, aflatoxin in your meat. If you get a letter, you have to figure it out a way to remove particular ingredient. So because it has a public health implication. The other mycotoxins are not directly associated with public health, but they are more associated with the subclinical losses for cows, right? And we divide them in risk, in different risk levels, low risk, medium risk, or high risk, right? And I see a little bit, maybe we will get to the point that we can better define some of these ranges, right? For each one of the categories. But what we know is, for example, DON is the most predominant. So if I do 100 samples, 65 samples will come positive for DON. So DON is the most, important. Zearalenone is another one. Aflatoxin, I do get it, and some of these, get it. So usually is when you get a mycotoxin issue, you will get more than one. It will be a mix, like 4 or 5 mycotoxin, right? It happened that you don't have aflatoxin, but you have the others, right? So the others we have to deal with the cow. DON is extremely difficult to control, extremely difficult, because most of the binders will not work, right? It's a mycotoxin, very difficult to deal with. Zearalenone to some extent, but DON is, you need a deactivator to be able to control that, right? So, and there are a number of labs that will offer. I just placed 3 here, but there are many others that has same quality and offer the same services. Let's say that you have 4 mycotoxins, right? So what I do with all these 4 mycotoxins? In this case, this is one of the examples that I got it from one of the clients that we work. So they got these 4. The 4 things that I need to know is which one of the mycotoxin is, and the concentration, right? Now, I'm getting worried when I get mycotoxin medium level and high, right? If it is low level, because most feed will do have mycotoxin, but they are in the low level, so you don't see much of the issue there. When you get to the medium level or the high level, it's a problem, right? So these 4 mycotoxins, they all were in the medium or high level, right? In the medium or high level. And you can see that each one of the mycotoxins has a specific effect, right? A specific effect, or they target a specific organ or a specific system, right? So DON is very aggressive, right? And it affects the digestion. Inside the rumen is very toxic, right? And it affects rumen function, it affects a specific population of bacteria, right? And in particular, the ones that produce the B complex vitamin. For high producing cows, this is a really bad mycotoxin to deal. And in my experience in the field, we do have in corn, but also the highest prevalence that I see is in wheat straw, right? We've done 84% of the wheat straw testing, it came positive for DON. Out of that 84%, 50% has more than 1,000 ppb, right? And we do the inclusion of 30%. 30% inclusion with that high DON contamination will contaminate the entire TMR. So you really need to think about it, right? The implication based on the inclusion rate, right? The first step is you're gonna make a decision if you're gonna use one of these additive or binders, right? And that depends on which one of the, mycotoxin you are dealing with. And there is a number of binders that I think are working, fairly well. They do have a cost. And you have to balance, depending on the year, the benefit and the cost, right? Second one, you had to make an assumption that some of these binders are also specific, meaning the same as dirt. They will do sequestration of a specific amino acid like copper, selenium, and vitamin E, right? An amino acid, about 30% of the amino acid, you could lose. So there is an adjustment that you need to do. Buffer, because especially you're dealing with DON, you have to adjust your buffer. And then you got to make a decision in some of these rumen protected, B vitamins and amino acid, right? To overcome some of these inflammatory processes that the mycotoxin will trigger. So now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna show you these monitoring processes. I'll tell you the story about this. The Schuhart chart, they were developed back in 1920s, right? To make sure all the cars has the same weight, right? Before these processes were developed, I'm not talking about 1920, so almost 100 years old. And cars could be like 300 kilos different between the cars. So they start putting in place these processes, right? So they were monitoring the mean, a bolt or a nut, right? And they would see how much is the coefficient of variation. So they were very simple stuff, but it allowed that every industry providing or supplier providing something, they were all the same weight, the same size. And so at the end of the day, they end up with the same weight, right? Let's say an example of a car. So what I did is I took some of these monitor process, especially to track the mean. The mean is not a good metric. So what you want to know is how much variation you have within that particular mean. That is what really important. So now I identify this out of control variation to ensure that the process is consistent, especially when working with people on the farm. So here is an example. So we connect, the cow flow. This is the prepartum pen, and I'm monitoring. This is the average intake of the group. It's not individual intake; it's the average, right? I'm monitoring the refusal, right, on a daily basis. So this is connected to a dashboard on a daily basis. You can see this one, and then the cow flow, and this is the prepartum pen. So the cow flow is never constant. So there is cows in and out on a weekly basis. Right? What you can see, this is the summer. The summer effect is usually, rough. You will see more variation just because of the weather, right? And but we did have an event. This is poor hygiene. We opened one of these corn silage and haylage, especially not haylage, a hay, a batch of bad hay. Right? And we end up having this poor hygiene, a contamination with dirt, quite a bit of mycotoxins, right? And also bad fermentation, right? And the cows will tell you. It will tell you right away. The refusal go up. There was inconsistency before. This is the summer. Cows will do. And what we monitor here is the mean plus, the green is 1 standard deviation, yellow is 2 standard deviation, and the red is 3 standard deviation, right? So the daily business is the art of controlling variation and managing risk, right? So, and right after we get all these, over with it, we were able to manage, that hygiene crisis, and everything get more consistent, right? And as soon you can see the refusal get a little bit more consistent, and the feeding, most of the feeding is just within 1 standard deviation. They do variate because of the cow move on a daily basis, especially for a prepartum that goes to the maternity, right? Another way to look at this is monitor. We do monitor gestation length. Gestation length, I think, is a great biological marker, right, that will tell you how the system is working, because it's very sensitive to this pro-inflammatory indicator, right? So here is where you see a really nice facility. Cows perform really well, right? This is lactation 1, lactation 2, and lactation 3, average gestation length, extended gestation, and the short gestation. In that particular case here, we do have some issues in particular. And in this particular case, the monitor, why we had too many short gestation is because of age. So these are breeding criteria. So they bred the heifers too early, and there is a number of them calving too young, right? And that usually those animals will have a number of them short gestation, right? So they do have some issues. Not only is it's bad for the heifer, but also it's bad for the newborn calf. And because they use 100% beef on dairy, especially for multiparous cows, you see that gestation length is almost very, it has been shifted. It has been shifted to having a little longer extension, right? Extended gestation length, which is something that we do pay attention to this, because you can have now a complete different problem. This is not a hygiene problem, but now the calves are coming too big. And when they come out too big, you see a lot of milk laceration in the birth canal, and then you see a little bit of pain, and pain is negative with dry matter intake. So you have to keep in mind how biology play out with the overall management. This is a similar situation, similar graph, but now we do have a problem. This is just 2 different facilities. Heifers are housed in 1 individual facility, and they do have a problem with this, poor hygiene. And you can see, that overall is 20%. Maybe the summer, usually summers are going to be higher, right? The summers are going to be higher, but in general, you can see quite a lot of short gestation. We don't want to see some of these situation on the farm. We do want to control something like this, right? So here is another large farms where we do have this contamination in TMR. This was a contamination, but we were able to manage through inclusion, right? Working with the inclusion, the ingredient. We knew that the TMR was contaminated. Now we went and see which one of the ingredients, if we could, manage in a different way, right? So not only that we had contaminated with mycotoxin, these 4 mycotoxin, 3 of which were high risk, right? And another one a medium risk, but also we have a lot of dirt, right? Contamination with dirt. And they come especially in the straw, right? But the batch of straw. So we did some adjustment. I'm not going to go through this one, but I'll let you, leave that information in the recording, right? So those are the inclusion adjustment. We did it, especially in the corn silage, the wheat straw batch, the alfalfa hay batch, and the grass hay batch, right, to adjust some of these transition diet. And this is what it looks, the farm. So they have about 20% average, gestation lengths, there is variation, quite a bit of variation. Summer is usually high, right? Summer is usually high. It is very, 30% high is really high, right? The 30% of the cow with short gestation. Once we did the intervention, that was right after the summer, we did an intervention about October. So about a month later, we start seeing this drop in cows. So just monitoring the maternity, because these are large farm in a month, you know the effect. So in this particular case, we manage only the ingredients, right? We have no binder whatsoever, right? But they reduce gestation length by 50%, from 20% average all the way to 10%. And it has a profound positive effect in the maternity, with the colostrum volume, morbidity in the calf, and the choline, especially choline because of the health event early on in lactation. And I really want to make a point here in the ash content, right? So the ash content we were able to reduce because the farmer, whatever, not always this is possible on a farm. We reduced from 11% to 5%, right? This is a 54% reduction, right? So what that means, each percentage point over 5%, 5% is what 6% is what, let's say, normal should be in the TMR, right? In the TMR, most TMR that I see here in the upper Midwest are about 5, right? And each point from 5 to 6, from 6 to 7, represent 10 kilos or 22 pounds of dirt per ton of feed, right? That is important because we remove a lot of dirt from the feed, right? So what that means, if I have 6-point difference and I multiply by 10, I get 60 kilos, right? Or 220 pounds, right? So now I did the calculation. If these are lactating cows, yeah, a ton of feed is, about 42 cows eat a ton of feed, depending on the milk production, but let's say about 42 cows. If it is a prepartum pen, it's about 62 cows, right? So now you calculate every day, these cows were eating anywhere between 1 kilo to 1.4 kilo of dirt. So that is the impact in the rumen, and this is why we see some of the fluctuation in milk component and a health event. And in particular, because we know that dirt also eliminates a binder, it will remove especially specific amino acids that are very expensive, trace mineral, right, and vitamins. When you do have a problem with hygiene, there is always a solution, right? And this is, for me, one of the easy solutions, because it's something that you already got in the farm, and you don't have to pay extra money for this. This is a large study. We look at a number of calves, right? 2 year, 15 farms, right? And we look at gestation length, short, average, or extended, and we have birth weight, right? Birth weight of the calf, right? And with that, we did what we call principal component analysis, right? So that means we combined it into one concept that is fetal programming. Remember, in the dry pen, from dry off to calving, you have 50% of the total calf growth. If the calf is coming out about 40 kilos, 80 pounds, right? 20 kilos were produced in the last 60 days, 40 pounds, so 50%. If you do have issues with hygiene, you see that the cow struggle, feed, colostrum is usually, you might have also colostrum, but this is an opportunity for you to think about it. Maybe you need to buy, some of these colostrum supplement, right? Because this is the range. Look at, poor fetal programming. This is summer effect, short gestation, light birth weight, right? And the best fetal program. These are the best fetal programs. Even in these cases, in bad fetal programming, feeding to colostrum almost always has a positive effect, a significant positive effect when it comes to the probability of mortality, right? So there is a solution for this. Sometimes you see a problem, start on default. It's good to feed, to feed colostrum, but in particular, if you have some of these hygiene problems in your prepartum cows, right? So I'm going to show you I think I have a few more slides and we are done here. Like this is wheat straw that is collecting these bags, right? Really good quality. They are pre-chopped, ready to be used, never get wet, or very rare occasion they get wet. These are good things. Things like this really need to be careful. When you see molds and when you see a lot of dirt on top, you really need to be careful, because things like this will cause a tremendous problem, especially when we are feeding about 30% of our diet are, wheat straw in our dry cow diet, right? When you see things like these, these are usually not a good sign. You see there is a lot of molds and a lot of mycotoxin on these. So you're going to end up with some of these hemorrhagic bowel syndrome, especially in high-producing cows, right? So things like stones, the cleaning the feed bank, right? This is something, a great opportunity. You clean this one, and it has a profound effect for cow. They build up a lot of bacteria, mold, yeast, right? And this, I like this picture because this is nothing wrong, the animal, but what the issue is here is it's just a bad design, right? So the animal has to get in to be able to get, their feed, and that is when the contamination comes with dirt. So they are contaminated their own feed because of the design. So you had to be a little bit mindful of this. And this is another, areas where we had to work to prevent a contamination with dirt. Either our tractors going through the feed, right, or some of these, corn silage, they don't have a concrete pad, they are just on dirt, right? And usually some of these will have higher content of ash and their TMR, right? So there is a few reports on this. We have collected quite a lot of samples on, especially for wheat straw, and there is variation based on the year, right? There are some reports in Europe, they found the same, very similar information, right? We get like 80% of the wheat straw sample are contaminated, and out of that, 50% more than 1,000 ppb. So what that means, if I do 30% inclusion rate, my entire TMR is contaminated, and it's contaminated with medium high risk, right? So we really need to be mindful here on how we are, manage our diet, because just one ingredient can contaminate the entire TMR, right? So I'm not going to spend much time on this, but when it comes to the management at the farm level, especially to improve feed hygiene, right, there are 5 critical points. You had to optimize silage and forage fermentation, so that start from the farm all the way to the silo bunker, right? Now that you have the silo to work, how you do the logistic on the farm, especially from the silo, move that every day to the cow, to the feed bank, right? Maintenance of the equipment, this is a great opportunity that I see here, maintenance, and reduce, pathogen load and exposure, right? This is when we share equipment, we use same equipment to, clean the stalls, and then we push feed, so you contaminate with feces or dirt, and so here is important to think about it, how we do the logistic on the farm, and how we put together the team, to make sure we minimize contamination of feed. This is my last slide. I don't have a solution for this, but I do want to share, last week we were chatting with one of the farmers, and because this is, in particular farm, is a real issue, right? And in our cases in the US, is regulated, so we had to work with the Department of Agriculture, and in particular the division in the USDA, to make sure, how we approach and how we put together a program to control this. But this will have a profound negative effect. Not only that they eat the best ingredient, protein and energy, if they leave behind the poop, and the poop has a lot of salmonella and E. coli, right? Extremely, we see a drop in milk yield every time we have some of these wave of starlings on the farm. With that, I'll stop right here, Juan, and I'll take any question you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gustavo, for that presentation about managing feed hygiene for successful transition cows.